So as you can see from the geography of the stage, we're going to do this quite informally. The intention is for this to be a conversation. So first of all, welcome. Thank you for being here tonight on this rather perilous, rainy night. I mean, hopefully we're in a break in the weather. My name is Luiza Bialasiewicz, and I'm Professor of European Governance in the Department of European Studies and the Academic Director of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, ACES, that is sponsoring tonight's event. And we're very lucky to have with us tonight, and actually I'm standing, but I will sit down, two commentators who I think are, I should say, two Europeans, and I like that term, who are uniquely suited to discussing the challenges that the EU is facing today and the challenges to European democracy. So the focus of our discussion will be the new book that Jan Zielonka has just published. The title, as you see, is The Lost Future and How to Reclaim It. And the second part of the title is equally important, and we hope to speak quite a bit about that. Let me give you just a very brief introduction to our speakers. So Professor Jan Zielonka is Professor of Politics and International Relations at Ca' Foscari, the University of Venice, and also at the University of Oxford. Caroline de Gruyter is a columnist and correspondent for the NRC Handelsblad, among other European newspapers, other fora such as Foreign Policy, EU Observer, and somebody who's also very well known to the ACES audience. What we will do, as I said, is have this be not a kind of formal book talk, but rather, as I mentioned at the start, a conversation. So we will start out by asking Jan to tell us, why did you decide to write this book? What motivated you to write on this particular topic? And then we'll turn over to Caroline for a quick response, and then proceed from there in a very, as I said, conversational style before opening up the floor to all of you, to bring you into this conversation, because we very much hope that it can be indeed a shared discussion. So why The Lost Future? Although you were telling us that this was not a title that you picked originally, but why write this in this moment?
Because we feel that something is going wrong with our political system, and that democracy doesn't perform according to our expectations. And we try to understand it and fix it with the hope that we will do it on time before, Chinese model will be the only game in town. But look, there is no simple answer why there is something wrong with our democracy. My last book was about the liberal challenge. I tried to understand how come that people who voted liberals from center-left to center-right, one day abandoned them and started to elect people like Berlusconi, Meloni, Kaczynski, Urban. It was called counter-revolution. But then I realized that we have to go beyond kind of looking at individual, politician, party, that we have to understand more deeper problems with democracy. And here I try to argue that the major problem of democracy is that it is by its nature short-sighted, myopic, in terms of space and time. In terms of space, because it's basically constrained to national borders, while most of the problems are either transnational or local these days. Only some are really truly national. But democracy outside nation state is either non-existent or opaque. And in terms of time, because democracy by its nature is a prisoner of the current generations of voters. So politicians always say we try to, preserve future for our children and make pictures with babies, in electoral campaigns. But when they have to make tough choices, surprise, surprise, future is being sacrificed. And people with gray hairs usually benefit from those choices. And you can, I try to give example in various fields why it is so. And this used not to be a big problem, but since the era of internet, since the digital revolution, which totally revolutionized the notions of time and space, the problem multiplied. And so I try to explain what are the implications of this, because democracy hardly took notice of the internet, which, is with us only 30 years. What changes in democracy we had since? And this brings me, in conclusions, to surprise, kind of Middle Ages, where power was dispersed and not concentrated in the hands of nation states, as is the case at present. And this is surprising because, I'm a Polish national. I've grown up where the state and nation were sacrosanct. But as it happened, I wrote this book in Venice, where things were somewhat more complicated throughout ages. Yeah? And therefore, I feel pretty comfortable with my way of reasoning. But if you look at the book, I write about various different things. I write about networks. I write about accelerations or high-speed society and capitalism. I write about bubbles, caves, echo chambers. One chapter is even how politicians use and misuse history to shape the future. So I've read about various different things. And if you are not swayed by my argument, I hope you will like caricatures, which I managed to include into the book of Andrzej Mleczko. And this is a kind of contributions to our discussions. I simply think that we cannot get away to the word which passed by. As English tend to say, it's a water under the bridge. And we are getting nostalgic about democracy. We think that we can come back to these years of glory. I just review books of very famous theorists of democracy. They all said we have to come back to the roots. Well, I fear the station has passed. And we have to, therefore, to think about democracy in this digital era in a different way. But since I see here a lot of younger colleagues, I would say, like Italians say, tocca a voi. It's now in your hands.
So passing it on. And, as you said, nostalgia is a very dangerous beast, and especially nostalgia for a democracy that's, as you argue in the book, never really was. But I mean, you've written about many of these issues yourself, including about nostalgia for other forms of governance. But the floor is yours, Caroline.
Some things are very simple. Yeah, I think I'm fascinated by the same dilemma. Because we're all stuck in the nation state, and sometimes it's very good. But a lot of our problems and challenges are simply too large for the nation state. And as a person who lives in one country and then after a few years moves again, I'm actually getting completely stuck in that system. You know, when you get your first vaccination in Norway, and then you move back to Belgium, first they cut off your bank account because it can be suspicious. This happened to us, and we were not informed, etc. And this is what many banks do. And apparently in several ministries of foreign affairs, they are now talking to the banks on a regular basis because the banks are dead scared of fraud and money laundering and all that. But you get your first vaccination in Norway and the second one you want to have in Belgium, and there you need to have the proof for the Norwegian jab. I managed to get a print from the Norwegians who didn't understand the question. And I showed it to the Belgians, and they said, yes, but we cannot give you because in our system it doesn't show up, and the systems are not connected. So, okay, then you don't get a vaccination. You need to find a doctor who, tricks a little bit. But most importantly, we all needed a vaccination pass. And I travel a lot for my work. And, you cannot get into trains, you cannot get into planes. It's a real, it's not just the internet, it's also digitalization makes the nation state, it's totally myopic. Everything stops at the border, and it's actually worse than it's ever been before. I read Jan's book, thinking, because he told me I've written a book that I've never written before. I've never written a book like that. But it reminded me a lot, so I politely disagree, because the theme is the same as some of your previous books. And I know it because it reminded me a lot of Europe as empire. I actually wrote down a quote, but it's in my bag, which I used in my own book, comparing the European Union and the Habsburg Empire. And it is exactly about how to keep Europe, this agglomerate of nation states, flexible, fluid in a way, flexible also in that it can deal on a local level and on an international level and everything in between, overlapping jurisdictions, a lot of flexibility. And this book is about that too. So I politely disagree about the total novelty. The structure is different, of course. It is time and it is space. It is about time and it is about space, but the underlying dilemma is exactly the same. And I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you for that, Caroline. And I think, the pandemic was a very interesting, moment for that. I mean, you're mentioning, kind of negotiating different vaccine territorialities, let's just put it that way. And I think many of us in this room, I know even from conversations with colleagues and students, going through exactly this, where, we may be officially resident in one state, and then happened to have received our first vaccine in another state, and doing the kind of impossible, which, now, we're smiling about this, kind of precisely the absurdity of these, of these bordered divides, but it made life very complicated. But I think it revealed to us, something that we had forgotten about. Really the chimera of a space of free movement, and for us it was, still very much. Forget those who had to access the European space from beyond, not having EU-recognized vaccines. And this is just one moment of kind of discrimination that we can point to. But this disconnect, and I think this is exactly what you talk about in the book. So, of course, as a geographer, for me, a book that talks about the governance of time and space, at least on the space side, I think this is something that I recognize. But this disconnect is increasingly there, and I think all of us recognize that. But I think, what you point to is, okay, so how do you find new forms of government and governance that do not simply replicate, what states have tried to do. Because alas, as we all well know, during the pandemic, it was the rush to state forms. The first, whether it was to close the borders, to nationalize, procurement, which, we saw didn't last and, very long. But is this, what can states still do? Is this just an illusion fed by politicians that we can reclaim this sort of control over time and space?
Look, in order to have solutions, you first need to have a diagnosis. And the irony of history is that the most popular diagnosis is return to the nation state. This is what brings votes to politicians. I came to you from Italy when Meloni party and another part and Lega, who campaigned for strong nation state. Brexit. I lived through Brexit. What was Brexit? To bring power back from Brussels to Westminster. And you can say today this war in Ukraine is a typical kind of 19th century war where the Ukrainian nation is being born and against the foreign aggression, right? But I think it is too simple to reason this way, even though this is how majority people think. And mind this is not only on the right, this argument which is popular, because on the left, I have a lot of social democratic friends in Germany who would say, well, how can you have welfare state without strong borders and nation states so that you know that who pays taxes and among who you can distribute the wealth? And they would also tell you, well, how can you have democracy without strong nation state? The democracy we know is basically that there is a demos, identified demos, which is the nation in this particular case. We speak the same languages, we understand each other, we can deliberate at least. We don't deliberate in Esperanto, right? So all of those things, we have to have basic trust to each other, familiarity with each other. So this argument that we have to go back to nation states as a solutions for the problems which we have, either globalization or basically neoliberal failures and so on, is very popular and strong. But if you look at the practice, you see that all these efforts to bring the nation states backfire. Let's start with the Brexit. I've seen the sovereignty of Westminster when Liz Truss was basically humiliated by markets in a few short days. Where was the sovereignty of British Parliament? She just was deposed within several short days. And now, if you see a state of economy with Brexit, what is their sovereignty when they negotiated the Northern Ireland Protocol? They thought, oh, we can just throw it into the Thames. Well, they couldn't just throw it into the Thames. And if you see, as now, they started to calculate cost of Brexit, they realized it's more complicated. And the Scottish National Party is indeed trouble, but not because of Brexit, but for other things. But Scottish nationalists didn't go away.
It's alive and well.
Exactly. So what I want to say is that there was this myth that you can just proclaim absolute sovereignty, and then you realize that you hit the wall. Let's go with the pandemic, which you've mentioned. I remember we all closed borders. It was forbidden even to trade medicine or masks between member states of the EU. But very good. So state came back. This is what states do, asserted sovereign powers. But very quickly they realized that closing border between Italy and France doesn't make sense. The real problem was, that you don't allow people from Lombardy, Milan, to travel to the south to these summer houses in Campania or in Ischia also. And the president of Campania said, we don't want to have those people from Lombardy. They will bring virus to us. And the president of Regione Veneto said, I'm not going to wait for the government with vaccines. I'm going to call Putin myself and get some. And then they realized that the European Union, if they do not allow the European Commission to negotiate these vaccines, they will have to compete with each other. And surprise, surprise, the strong and rich will win over the weak and small. So they allowed the Commission to negotiate vaccines. And then they realized that to get out of the economic burden caused by pandemics, they need European Recovery Fund. Surprise, surprise. And even Mrs. Meloni even Mr. Kaczynski are trying to get this money from the European Union, even though they constantly like to run under national flags. So they realized that things are much more complicated. And that is the problem. And the problem is, and we talk so much about space, we can move to time later, I don't want to talk now too long, they realized, the more the discrepancy between formal powers and a functional ability to contribute to public goods is great, the system becomes dysfunctional. Informal politics takes over. EU is a very good example, because after the failure of European constitutions, nobody wants to change the treaty, but life goes on. So that they have to constantly find new arrangements to respond to challenges they face, yeah? You remember Varoufakis' story about ECOFIN, which is not in any treaty, basically, and takes decisions as they wish, with no transparency, yeah? But you have other things. You have now, for instance, American government adopting big package, Green Deal, supporting American enterprises. Well, if we want to compete with Americans, we need to have an equivalent. But how to have an equivalent? The European Commission doesn't have prerogatives, but they have to act. So the gap between the formal powers and the real world is growing. And it's not only between EU and nation states, it's also between cities and nation states. Because migration, we have somebody here who could tell you much more how Amsterdam has to handle migration. The state is deciding what we do about immigration. In Poland, they opened the borders for Ukrainians overnight, but they didn't move a finger to do anything with those millions of people coming. These were cities who had to find shelter for them, food, jobs later on. These were NGOs who had to do this job. The sovereign state just opened border. Thank you very much. And it is on the daily basis that those contrasts between what the state actually can declare as its prerogative and its ability to contribute to sort things out, the contrast is becoming unsustainable. And it's independent of who is in power. And that's the problem. Of course, we all want our person to win the elections. And I don't want to argue that it doesn't matter whether President Trump or Biden is President of the United States. I'm not going to make comments about Dutch politics here. But things don't change dramatically. They change to some degree because they work in a certain institutional setting. And if things are not fixed, Donald is waiting. And if not him, a similar. That is the problem.
that, you know, that part, which I find truly terrifying, is definitely the lost future, because if we're in the hands of politicians like that, which, you know, I mean, we already have plenty of our own examples, but I mean, part of it is, you know, I mean, what you're saying is that nation states at this point are affirming very often purely performative powers, right? I mean, but they can be very real and very violent. I mean, as you're saying in the Polish case, opening the borders to Ukraine while very tightly and violently shutting the Belarusian border and making sure, you know, nobody would be able to make their way through. So, you know, discharging responsibilities on cities as they have, and not just Poland. I mean, in the case, and many of you here in the room will know this, I mean, in the case of reception of Ukrainian refugees, it has been European cities, European NGOs, European citizens that have done the work of reception. So I think this is actually, you know, kind of a perfect example of, you know, states in a sense taking credit for this. But I think with this, you know, with this shift also, I think, which is also driven by the inability to perform, to deliver, as you know, as you write in the book, in part. But I think there's something else going on. I mean, and Caroline, I mean, you've written about this as well, also thinking about what's happening at the level of the EU, where we see an increasing role, I mean, for states in other ways as well.
Yeah. So, on the one hand, you see sometimes or often a total mismatch to the level where the problems and the challenges are, and you know, what's in the power of the nation state to tackle them. On the other hand, I must say I am sometimes also very impressed about how, on a European level, how the member states, while always complaining that, you know, we hand over sovereignty, national sovereignty, to this anonymous Brussels, and they have the power over us, and we lose power, we lose sovereignty, how at the same time they start to understand now, including this country here, that actually by being part of this group of the 27, you actually get sovereignty back as well. Simple example, if you have, if Facebook violates Dutch data protection rules and the Prime Minister phones Zuckerberg himself, Berg, right? Yeah. In California, the man will probably pick up the phone because Gruyter is a prime minister. But he will not change his behavior. The Belgians had this, and Facebook and Google too, they just went around Belgium for a while, you know, until they gave up, and they did. So then you're very alone, very small as a nation state. If a European commissioner, on behalf of 27 countries, calls Zuckerberg, he will sure pick up the phone. But, and this has happened several times, they change their behavior and they pay a big multi-billion fine on top of it, which flows back into the member states' treasuries. So I think member states increasingly realize that if they play the game well, if they team up, if they play together, I mean, on a minimum level, because they never do it totally, of course, they can solidify themselves. And this is what, in recent years, I have seen a lot of in Brussels. So the story about handing over sovereignty to Europe, to the EU, is actually now countered. This is the case, some of it at least, but is now countered by sovereignty flowing back. Let me give a few examples of that. The member states have the power in Brussels. They take all the important decisions. If before, they would take the decision and then step back and let the Commission implement the decision. Always. That's the Commission's job. Nowadays, we have more Europe in more sensitive areas than before. We're not talking about the shape of the bananas any longer. We're talking about security. We're talking about health. We're talking about defense. Sensitive, the currency, sensitive issues, which were dealt with by the nation state before, and which it only sort of started sharing power over very reluctantly with a knife on their throat. They tried to buy vaccines alone, and when that didn't work, they asked the Commission. But so what's happening now? They are jealous to hand over those areas, or too much of those areas, to Brussels. So what happens is they take the decision, and then they stay involved in the implementation phase, which is new. They never used to do this before. The vaccines, the Commission is doing negotiates the contracts. Then the drafts have to go past all the capitals, also some capitals of countries that have pharmaceutical industries themselves, and they check all the details of the contract and change bits here and there, start negotiating, start haggling again. With Next Generation, the projects, the Eurobonds, that, you know, we got that together in order to be able to help our economies to recover after the pandemic. So there's a lot of money involved, 800 billion euros. So every country wants to get, is sending its proposals for projects to be paid with that money to Brussels. Normally, a few years ago still, the Commission would have its experts judging all these proposals, like do they qualify, are they sustainable enough, whatever, the criteria are a whole list. Now, the member states are staying on in that phase, which in a way is good, I think, because if this is the price we pay for them doing these kind of operations, tant mieux. They feel ownership in a way. But it is also not good, or it could be not good, because what happens if a country like the Netherlands vetoes Italian projects? Is Italy going to hit back? And in which way? And in which field? So instead of, Europe was always good in depoliticizing things. Break them into technical bits, hence the bananas. Break them into technical bits and then try to solve those bits. And you take the political angle out, so member states will not start fighting again. This is to a certain extent, because it's the beginning. But you see, this opens the door to a repoliticization of issues. And it gives member states much more a finger in the pie of what is decided in Brussels and how it is implemented than before. So they have always called the shots in Brussels, but now even more than before. So there you see how they use the internationalization of things, of dilemmas, of challenges, of problems, to pump themselves up.
But, Caroline, but you haven't mentioned in this long story a citizen once.
No.
States and EU institutions. And we assume...
The question was about the nation state, not about the citizen.
But that is exactly the problem. We assume that these are good for the citizens, but all technical decisions have redistributive, consequences, where some citizens, of firms win and others lose. It's not only zero-sum game, But to deny that there are no winners and losers of all this, technical, supposedly technical decision would be simply a problem. And you can even say that states prefer to do things in Brussels because they are isolated from their own, they don't need to talk to their own people, and basically they will always tell us, yeah, we would like to do it differently, particularly if things go wrong. But Brussels, they will be always first to give blame to Brussels, but when there is success, to take it. So you see,
double discours.
So this is the problem. So democracy has to balance two aspects. On the one hand, citizen participation. On the other hand, system efficiency. Democracy, which only provides for procedural, clarity that citizens, those who are elected, do what basically represent people will, and there is division of power, so the winner doesn't take all. The different institutions have to balance each other, and there is a scope for deliberation. This is, but this is not enough, because democracy has to solve the problem as they go along. When there is pandemics, what kind of deliberations? When there is financial crisis, what kind of, we have it recently. The Swiss federal government conducted merger of UBS and Credit Suisse, two giant banks, over a weekend. I haven't heard about any referendum. And a lot of people, the money moved instantly overnight to various actors. And you see, but they done it, it was not contested on the assumption that the alternative would be even worse. And this is exactly the problem. You see, how can we balance the basic principle of efficiency and participation with the word which is not confined to territory where democracy really functions?
But who are blocking this in Europe?
And
who are blocking it?
With the speed. In Europe, since financial crisis, we have governments by decree all the time. Financial crisis, migration crisis, pandemics, now war.
But you have to answer Caroline's question. So who is it that's
blocking the democratization on a European level? Who are keeping democracies strictly national? It's the member states.
Yes, but things are more difficult.
They don't want pan-European parties. They block this in the European Parliament. They are the ones who decide over which subjects the European Parliament can co-decide.
Correct.
They also determine what to do, for instance, with the great democratic experiment that has just been held. It started under the wrong stars, of course, because it was Macron's pet project. It was the European Citizens' Assembly, which was a great experiment, which produced clear results. There was underreporting in the press because...
And incredible participation
across Europe. There was incredible participation, and even some of the jealous member states, including the Netherlands, but also Belgium, the member states sent heavy ambassadors into that assembly just to make sure that it would not grow out of proportion. These people, in the end, really started liking what was going on because it was so nuanced and it went so well and people were enthusiastic. But who then decide not to do anything with the results? It is, again, the member states.
Absolutely.
This is a huge problem. Everything is international or local, but the member state, the democracy has totally remained national. And the more powerful the member states are in Europe, fluidity or not, flexibility or not, the less we will see a development.
But in
ministers hate the European Parliament.
By nature, and this is something what not, Mrs. von der Leyen invented. This was what Mr. Jean-Jacques Rousseau invented. That democracy with citizens' involvement works best in small units. Because obviously the government in The Hague, however contested, is closer to the Dutch citizens than the government in Brussels, which is not so far away. But still, you know what I mean. The size matters here. And the whole point is to make sure that we find ways of bringing citizens in. But we partly don't even look for this for the reason, exactly as you described, that member states says, sorry, but we are here democratic, and who is in democracy the sovereign? The nation. Yeah. And so all of them come back from meetings of the European Council and give press conferences in the national languages and say, I defended our national interest. Since they all claim the same, they couldn't obviously all succeed because you know that there were some trading courses there. But they all do this. And actually, I'm not surprised that they do this. This is their job. They are supposed to defend electorate, those who elected them interest. Of course, you can interpret this interest less narrowly than they often do. But this is exactly what I try to say. This is the nature of the system which has become increasingly dysfunctional. That we have to open up and start thinking how to do this now. It will not happen only because we here, or Citizens' Assembly, will come with a solution, because this is about power and this is about money at the end of the day. And in the history of humanity, there was always, but you start with ideas. Before you organize protests, for instance, you got to know what you want to achieve, where you are going to. And this is exactly why we need to start this conversation.
But this conversation is producing a lot of fear. And I think going back to what Carolina was saying, the fact that both European institutions, but especially member states, were so eager to intervene in the proceedings on the Conference of the Future of Europe. I mean, they made sure to have representatives or just completely dismiss it, means that, you know, there is this fear. And I mean, back also to your comment about, you know, presuming or claiming to represent the national interest in any European negotiation. You know, member states cover each other's back on this, you know, and facilitate this. I mean, there's a group of students here in the room who are with us in Brussels, you know, thinking about how certain negotiations go forward, where it is very much horse trading, you know, to allow everybody to go home and say, we got it, we got what we needed to get. So, you know, there is this agreement between member states, certainly at the European level, to, you know, to cover each other's back and to keep the game going. So how do you break the game? Because the game is not working anymore. And I think one of the key things that you say in the book is, you know, we keep the game going, or, you know, member states of the EU, we can say nation states in general, keep the game going. But, you know, it's broken. I mean, and, you know, the question of trust, which you raise in the book, that is what's breaking down. I mean, the lost future is the sensation and the real feeling that electorates, you know, no longer place trust in their elected officials.
Well, one thing that you could do, for instance, is, but they block it too at the moment, is introducing European taxes. Because now the member states say, with some right, like, look, if you want to spend something, European Commission, wherever, in the EU or in Ukraine or on whatever, it's our taxpayers' money. So, you know, we have, we determine how much you will get. And now, because we pay a lot for Ukraine, von der Leyen doesn't have enough money, because the member states decide, okay, we spend this and we spend that, and it's all, the budget is not big enough. So von der Leyen, she cannot afford it any longer. She now has to go hat in hand to all the capitals and beg for money. This is now what she's doing. And so the power is also because of the tax question is in the hands of the member states completely. But at the same time, they are cutting. So they ask for more Europe, the member states, and they get it. At the same time, for instance, the European Foreign Service was just cut again 5%. And they do this at the same time.
But it is not only to allow the EU to have more tax money, it's also to allow cities and, you know, to benefit more from the public money if they perform public goods. And they happen to perform public goods, from health, transport, security, education. I mean, they basically filled in the gap abandoned by states to a large extent on the ground, you know, not in the legislation, because the states still legislate, you know, but they are not allowed to, you know, most of the things they can tax us is to give us a fine for parking our bicycle wrongly, you know, and which doesn't make them very popular in this sense. But if you look at budgets which cities are having for the task they implement, and then there are firms and NGOs which are not necessarily with nation-state Europe only in mind, because most of firms are just global actors, although globalization largely, economists will tell you, manifests itself in a regional context, not totally global. And there are NGOs which campaign for, you know, if you campaign for human rights, you don't only grant human rights to your nations or to members of the European Union. You should go beyond that, right? And so basically, those issues have to be brought into picture too, because it's not only about member states in the EU, however important, you know, and I spent, as you know, most of my life trying to work out this cohesion, but I'm just increasingly thinking that different actors and different levels, those who contribute to public goods should get, you know, basically access to decision and resources, and we have to find viable ways of doing this. And not as the Pact of Amsterdam, you know, it pronounced, we welcome cities' contributions to public life, but it didn't give them any rights or any resources. Thank you very much. This doesn't work this way. And even with firms, we talk about this, Ariel, I would rather want those firms having representation, say, in the second chamber of parliament and argue their case, which I think is important, that they argue this there and not in the corridors of powers in Brussels, you know, or that you say that they lunch less together with officials these days. I take it for granted, you know restaurants of Brussels better than me, but if they're empty, okay. But you know what I mean. There got to be a way to involve those actors who really are players here to come more to the fore. But this is tricky, and I will stop here.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, it's interesting that you mentioned the Pact of Amsterdam, 2016. That's a while ago. I mean, and to think, you know, where we have come since then, and, you know, ACE's predecessor, Access Europe, actually had a whole series of events, and I think, you know, many of us were really kind of excited about what this will bring, you know, not just those of us doing urban geography, but really thinking this was, you know, kind of this great opening. And, you know, I mean, cities have taken on more and more roles de facto, and have been forced into them by the retreat of the state as well, which, you know, this is something that we haven't mentioned. But I think I'd want, you know, to push the discussion still kind of further, because I think it's not just a question of rescaling, whether it's from the EU to the national level, to the urban level or regional level. I mean, the failures or, you know, kind of the challenges are more complex than that, because it's not just a question of scaling up or scaling down. if you're going to create new forms of democratic participation, new forms of democratic decision-making, I mean, surely just, kind of bringing it down. I mean, okay, you're saying in terms of accountability, in terms of trust, that may make a difference. But some of the processes, actually almost all of the processes you describe in the book, cannot be governed at the urban scale. I mean, they can barely be governed at the national scale or even at, the EU scale, from, climate change, take your pick, to, digital threats, flows, however you want to frame them, and other global risks. So, how do we deal with this? This is why the
international level is so powerless. We have 4 levels of governance. We have the local level, we have the provincial level, we have the national level, and the European level. And all these levels have their own responsibilities. And they should have their own money that goes with it. Huh? Whether it's generated by taxes or otherwise, and democratic representation. But everything, and it's always gone like this in history, that powers are regularly shifted up or down, according to fashions, according to needs, according to, what was better at the time. We get more Europe now, but at the same time, European trade policy is being nationalized, so that you can talk about this and you can just look at the problems and determine, okay, it doesn't work anymore at this level, let's try it 1 level up or down. This is normal. But where it doesn't work is, here it works because they all have powers and money. And also legitimacy. The EU can force a company which pollutes a river somewhere. In Italy, if the Italian government, which has the responsibility to act, doesn't act, the European level can do it. And we have a court, and we have many ways to do it. This is entirely lacking on the international level, where you have the big multinationals, where you have the United Nations. The United Nations can produce beautiful reports. Nobody cares. Hardly anything happens with them. Why? Because they cannot enforce decisions. We are lucky in Europe to have these 4 levels that can enforce decisions. And I wish we would use, the scaling up and down a little bit more wisely. And attribute the money and the power that goes with the responsibility.
Caroline, is the caveat. This is how I used to think before I started to study internet. And I'm certainly not very skillful, even technology player. But if you read students of internet, what they tell you, the greatest beneficiary of digital revolutions were networks, not the formalized organizations. Why networks? Because they are more exactly flexible, they are less institutionalized, they are basically more adjustable, and they are quicker. And the internet allowed them to coordinate things the way they were unable to do because of their semi-transparent nature before. Read Manuel Castells. And since Castells, many other people went even further with this. So if the networks, which are different sort of animals than the organizations we talked so far, like cities, states, EU or UN, are really here the key players increasingly, and think about financial networks, for instance, yeah? Then we're in trouble. Now, it's also true that the EU is also acting increasingly as a network, although, formally speaking, is treaty-binded, but since treaties cannot be changed, it basically constantly negotiates, as you describe it, on different levels, and it really acts as a network, and therefore it can get things done better. It's also cities that act as networks. Cities are not interested in so much formal institutional structures, borders, you know, hierarchies. They just go sideways rather than, you know, they are from like a different galaxy to some extent, right? Mm-hmm. So some of those actors actually act like networks more and more. But what I also have seen is that those states, and I think Holland is one of them, which understand that success depends on working hand in hand with networks, like EU, like cities, but also like bodies like Randstad, which is not really, I think, even legal entity. But can you imagine Dutch government ignoring Randstad making any decisions? That those governments which actually understand that you have to work with those other bodies, formal and informal, or NGOs, rather than trying to criminalize NGOs, and they increasingly try in Poland, in Hungary, you know, in Italy, yeah, that those are much more successful. Mm-hmm. So maybe the first step is not to reinvent the wheel or totally indifferent word, but to make states to work with the others. And how to do this, that is politics. Because they will not do it from their own will, because as you rightly said, each time there is a problem, they said, oh, we are here in charge. Why the United Nations doesn't have powers? Because member states don't allow it. Why the van der Leyen goes around begging money? Because the money she has is from member states. Very simple. They are the gatekeeper. And there got to be a way to make them work differently. And this can only be done through politics, so to speak. But as I said, first you need to diagnose what is the situations before you try to do this. Because, and here I finish, the intellectual trap we got into ourselves on EU nation states level was alternative nation states or European states. Why? I prefer EU acting like a network, not like a state. And actually, I don't think it works like a state very well. Take democracy. You have a parliament, you know, you have a court, but it obviously it's not like a state. So there is no sense to pretend that this is a kind of state writ large. But we have to accept a different way of looking on those actors and give them a chance to work differently than so far.
I agree with that. I think there's nothing wrong with the 4 levels that we have. The problem we have is that one level is totally dominating all the others, which is the national level. If they would give the other levels a little bit more space to breathe, including financial space, because that's important. Money is very important. Otherwise, you can't do anything. The other levels cannot flourish. It's like the province of Drenthe in the Netherlands blocking Dutch foreign policy, for instance. Everybody would think that is completely crazy. But this is what's happening on a European level. And I think also by giving the European level just barely enough to survive, because it's the member states who decide on the budget, they are not letting it thrive. I'm not saying that everything should be European. I think there are many things that should not be European. I mean, I'd rather have less Europe, in a way, which was functioning better, which would get the means and the power to really do what it's supposed to do. Look at migration, asylum and migration policy. This is completely blocked since 20 years, unworkable, by the member states bickering. Yeah. So sometimes I wish also that in Brussels, if member states come again and ask for more Europe, because they can't solve the problems alone and they turn to Brussels, can you do it? That the Commission should sometimes say, no, we will only do it if you let us do it well. And we know how to do it well. Give us the means and the power to do it well. But because now it's just a little bit here and a little bit there. And no wonder then, we come back to the beginning, is that people have trouble trusting the EU because it cannot really function well. And the member states have all the money and the power to do it.
And, you know, I mean, it would be nice to think that this would be a possibility that, you know, I mean, and I can just say, you know, personally,
say no.
Well, I mean, I don't see the current commission that, if anything, is keen to extend its powers rather than, you know, kind of curtail them in a range of fields. But also, you know, due to political pressures, whether it's the upcoming elections, the renewal of the commission, and so on. So the very same dynamics, I mean, they're different electoral dynamics than the ones you identify at the national scale, but still they're very much there. I mean, I want to leave some time for discussion because, you know, we've identified some problems, and your book, I think, is very much a diagnosis, and I like the Italian title of the book, Myopic Democracy, much better. Because I think, you know, the lost future already is a bit apocalyptic. But we'd be very keen to hear from you both regarding the diagnosis that has been offered, but also, you know, the second part of the title, so how to reclaim this lost future. If not the lost future, then I would say let's reclaiming the democratic present. Let's start with that, maybe. Who wants to take this on? Malte, go for it. The mic is coming.
Yeah, thank you very much. Professor Zielonka, at the beginning you said that in democracies, the politicians or the democracy is kind of being held hostage by the current generation of voters. And I was wondering a bit, could you redeem that if you practice democracy at a different scale? Wouldn't that be the same in a transnational or in a more local democracy? And how can democracies then best address long-term crises such as climate change? Or would networks be better at that? But where would then the networks derive their democratic legitimacy from? Or do they not need that, maybe? Thanks.
Do you want to respond right away? And then...
No, look, first of all, let's stick to what we know before we speculate what will work or not will work. What we know now is that more and more people, particularly from your generation, don't even bother to vote, even less so are happy to join political parties. You know, political parties used to be much with members. How many members have political parties these days? And if they have members, I once, you know, tried to figure out the membership of British Conservative Party, and I had real problems to find data, and the data I found, the average age was 67. And somebody corrected me, no, it's 63. Well, you know what I mean.
Super.
Yeah. This is including the current cabinet, which includes a lot of young people, you know, around 40 or so. What I want to say is, and I think the real problem was during the financial crisis. There was this poster of in the gallows was saying, with a man with a scotch on their face, and said, "We have a vote, we don't have a voice." And the problem at the time, they wanted to say that we can choose the government, but we cannot choose policies, because policies are done somewhere else. You know, you can, in fact, you know, why the origin of all this populist movement or anti-liberal movement arose from this, that we had rotations between center-left, center-right parties. You could choose the different cabinet, you know, prime minister, but in the end, they followed neoliberal economic script because, of course, there were no alternatives. In fact, they tolerated or even encouraged rising inequalities because actually they said, you know, you cannot do anything about this. And they basically follow certain policy pattern which which didn't fundamentally change the policies conducted by states. I mean, take migration policy. The difference between left and right today in Europe, I mean, they all agreed that we have to pay autocrats, you know, in Libya or Turkey to keep migrants out of our shores. They all cut on development aid. They all supported various wars in the region generating migrants. I mean, there's not even much investment in our neighborhood in the south these days. And then we are surprised we have, and they all broke one environmental pledges after another, right? And then they are surprised that people are coming en masse, and they believe that Mr. Erdogan or some Libyan warlords will keep people out because we brought them now, I don't know how much money, to Tunisia, another nice guy. You know, Tunisia used to be a democratic country, but this president is not one of them. And you know, and what you can do about this? See, this is what we have, and this is where you can say the future is lost, because I start the book with an anecdote, you know. I start the book with an anecdote that I walk during elections in America, and somebody hands me a badge of Donald Trump. Donald, you are our only hope. So I thought, if in this country Donald is the only hope, this is supposed to be a champion of democracy, right? But then I look at the European statistic and I learn that in most of European countries, some 80% of people do not believe that their children will be better off than themselves. Well, there is a problem here. If you don't believe that your children will be better off. And how do you think, why would you think that they will be better off? Do you really think that you will have a pension tomorrow? Do you really think that you know that you will be free of wars as we experience now, and the migration will somehow you know, evaporate? No, you certainly don't think that the climate change will just be arrested, yeah? So I'm not surprised that the statistics show this, you know. And so this is the problem. We still go to vote, but I've noticed in recent elections in different countries I know, that what we want is to prevent other people getting into the office. But there is no much hope that if our people will win, they will be any better. It will be better than those, as we call them, crises. But do you believe that if our people will win, things will change for the better? You know, it makes me think about the Soviet times jokes, you know. And I've here finished, you know. There's this train going through Siberia, and in the train there is Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev. And the train stops at a certain moment. And Stalin gets angry, orders to execute the train conductor. So they execute the train conductor, but the train doesn't move. So Khrushchev says, let's rehabilitate, post-mortem, the train conductor, you know, and the train doesn't move still. And Brezhnev says, comrades, let's close the curtains and act as we are going. I think that we're in this kind of situation, and I was very pleased that
Jan, can I be the devil's advocate? Don't you think we've always been in this kind of situation? Has this future ever been? I hear you, but has the future ever been sure?
Nothing is sure. The only sure in life is that we will be dead. You know, other things I don't know what is sure. But in my personal case, you ask me, I started as democracy campaigner under the other side of the Iron Curtain. Mm-hmm. I was fighting for democracy when we had little hope that it will ever come. Then it came, and I don't. And you know what is in my country now. The government who is basically battling women because they want to have the right, you know, to basically to minimal, to restricted abortion rights, which they even gave away. Battling, you know, LGBT community, battling migrants, and I want to organize a referendum on the quota migration, basically to demonize everybody who is coming by making this national kind of manifestations of xenophobia. You know, I couldn't believe that this can be like, you know, I never, look, I'm a student of democracy. I know democracy was always in crisis. I know there is not, you know, but the alternatives are even worse. But I see that those alternatives, economically, for instance, are doing pretty well, not just China. Poland, growth, 11%. How much growth you have in this country? 2? 1? 0. There is a problem here.
So we have a couple of hands up. I think Christina, Brian, Frederick, did you have one as well? Yeah. Christina, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I would like to challenge the solutions on and how to reclaim it. I mean, I hear from Caroline that we should move power to the EU, including the Commission. Arguably, that is quite undemocratic. I mean, the area I study, external relations, we can see the Energy Charter Treaty as the recent example. The Commission trying to hold everything under lids, above all any discussion in the public sphere, and trying to push through a reform that they have been negotiating for the past, 3 years in 2022. Now, finally, after a long time, they have bent to public opinion, increasing public opinion, including from the member states, including from this member state, to consider withdrawal. From Jan, I hear networks. Okay, networks in principle have, of course, the beauty of creative flexibility, I would say. So we could think, yes, there's something in terms of problem solution, which I also give the Commission to a degree, yeah, problem solution potentially in some areas. But democratic is neither of the two. When I think of networks again, the next thing that comes to mind is, again, coordination, for example, in mixed agreements, like the prime example in the European Union, of where the European Union and the member states work as a sort of network, where we don't know who does what. I mean, if agency work as networks, we don't know who does what. What do we then, how can you exercise democratic control about that? So the whole beauty of decentralization and the flexibility, creativity means you don't have a hierarchy, so you don't know who's deciding. So you don't know how to vote for if you point it back to voting. So I think both solutions in my optic are very undemocratic. There might be problem solving, but not democratic. That's my first point. So I would like to hear your reaction, both of you, on that. And to the second one, I think, when I also read part of your book, now you framed it slightly differently, Jan, that the fear that our children are not better off than ourselves. So in the book, it also has a clear economic dimension. And what I completely miss in that, the link to climate change. Who could expect our children to be even more hypermobile, more consuming, as all of us in this room, yeah? I mean, that's impossible. That will only mean that we have to kill off all Indians, Bangladeshis, and everybody else who's in heat zones and underwater. That's the only way we can ensure that our children are economically better off. I think at present, in any event, there's no technical solution to generate the energy that we would need to make our children economically better off. So hopefully, my children are not better off.
Shall I go first?
Do you want to go first?
I think you make a little bit of a caricature of it, Christina. I'm sorry. I'm not saying that all the power should be up to the European Union and more money. What I'm saying is that we should solve the problems and tackle the issues on the levels that are best at dealing with them. But, as I also indicated, that also means the member states should the national level should become less dominant in this. And also stop blocking democratizing the European level. Because many people are trying this, and I think it is excellent. But it's the member states who are blocking this. It's part, and parcel of the same story. And as I said, if we can't do this, and we let the European level, which can solve certain problems or can tackle certain issues, if we let it function like it functions now, it is not good. So maybe it should do less even.
Jan, do you want to take it now?
Look, two things. On environment, I agree with the last comments, but very much depends what does it mean economically better. You know, if you know, I actually believe that people should have the right to a house. You know, but it can be heated differently than it's heated now, right? So you know what I mean. I'm now have solar energy in my house. I'm economically better because I have a house. But the all energy, including for the car, is solar energy. So you see, there's a way to do this. This is not a nothing game. And this is probably the most important, you see. While I don't recommend a revolution, in fact, most of the things I say are banal. I didn't invent them, I just put them together. Like networks, right? The networks benefited from digital revolution. It's very difficult to question this. But when, I will even reinforce your argument. When you say networks, I immediately in Italy think about organized crime and mafia. When I think about networks, I think about those people who are bullying others on the Twitter. So, but there are networks which actually contribute to public goods. They are willing and able to contribute to public goods. And you can find ways to involve them in governance system. But because of the nature of these bodies, which are more informal and less institutionalized, law is not, for instance, the best way to regulate the relationships. And yes, I don't recommend that we give up elections. But I just said to you a second ago that elections are not the best way to represent us in various ways, partly because we are prisoners of political parties, which are necessary to organize the current democracy, electoral democracy. And second, we learn that autocrats can organize elections and manipulate them beautifully. Probably better than Democrats, you know. But with all this, you see, there is a warning against one thing. And this is journalists like this most, but not only. We all want to tell me what we could do. Give me one or two examples of what we could do to fix the things. And I even write about the book. You know, I'm giving reluctant recommendations because this is like, you know, you fly tomorrow to Florence, and at the airport, what kind of books you find? You find how to become a millionaire investing nearly no money, or how to lose 20 kilos in 2 weeks, yeah? A manual on wasting 20 kilos in 2 weeks. So this is equivalent of what the simple solutions to sort out complex problem would mean. And I'm not against simple solutions. We constantly apply simple solutions to complex problems. We, for instance, introduce inheritance tax or minimum wage. Will they sort out inequality? No. But we hope that they contribute to sorting out inequality. Not much, as we learned from experiences, and we can debate this. But you know what I mean? You have to start somewhere. But you cannot think that by 1 or 2 institutional tricks, you sort out such a problem like citizen participation, system effectiveness, and basically in complex society which are torn by ethnic and national competitions, if not conflict. No, you cannot. As it would be so easy, very good.
Can I say one more thing? Mm-hmm. When I look at the young generation, I get a lot of hope. And I'm talking to you there in the back of the room. I look at my own kids and I see how they changed our household, for instance. We have all kinds of funny stuff in the fridge that, 10 years ago we wouldn't even have heard of. And because the kids want to eat them, and they made us eat them. And since we were unwilling to cook with it because we didn't know how it worked, they did it for us, and it was delicious. And now we're using it ourselves. We're eating much less meat. We're flying less. I mean, I'm still surprised to see such busy traffic at airports. It's all because our kids told us not to do this. And they're very political, much more political than I was at that age, and all their friends are the same. I think it's also good to put some trust in. I mean, change is coming. It is already there. And sometimes I don't think we appreciate it enough.
No, I mean, and I think that's, kind of to the first question regarding political participation. There are different forms of political participation just because you do not become a member of a traditional party. But I think, back to Christina's question, I think the problem is what kind of future are we imagining and what's considered a good future, a desirable future, a good life in general, and how to get there. And I think that's, the first question to ask is what is a good future before, we kind of diagnose how to get there. So Frederick and Brian.
Frederick or Brian?
You can deliberate between the two of you. Whoever gets the mic first.
No. Please. So thank you. I want to push you on the national democratic part of the story that gets dismissed early in the argument. I haven't read the book, as I've confessed to you already, but in the presentation it's clear that you want to start with the observation that national level democracy fails the challenges of both time and space, right? So the space point is that, of course, our problems are global, not national, and the time is things like social media, internet, AI. These have sped up our lives in ways that challenge democratic deliberation, certainly national democratic deliberation. And then you quickly move to a story about what that means for the national versus the supranational. So both of you spoke especially to that latter issue. And so my challenge is to make the claim that the real problem has been a democratic deficit at the national level. It has nothing to do with globalization or Europe and time and space the way you're talking about. It has to do with the systematic exclusion of many voices, poor people, people of sort of non-native backgrounds, the breakdown of the party system to really listen to those kinds of voices, property rights distribution in ways. Basically, you could come up with either a lefty or a more cultural-focused critique of national democracy, but that's where the problem lies. And that raises for me the real question for the topic that is an ACES topic, a Center for European Studies topic, which is what could Europe do about that? What could the European level do about that? My own reading of the development of national democracy is that federal institutions, the higher level institutions, bludgeoned the lower level institutions to be more democratic, even though the lower level organizations, like say states in the American Republic and the American South, were claiming that democracy was suffering under federalism. The same thing is said by a lot of nation-state representatives in Europe, that their own national democratic sovereignty is threatened by Brussels. But the truth is, what I think is necessary is a shadow of democratic hierarchy in Europe, so that Europe forces, pushes, claims the territory of democracy and pushes it at the national level. So I would like to hear the extent to which you disagree with that kind of diagnosis, and whether it's possible for Europe to play a stronger role in reshaping national democracy.
Who wants to go at it first? Jan, do you want to start?
No, look, I believe, who will be the agency to do this? You see, the whole idea of European integration was to, as my late friend and colleague Alan Milward argued after war, was to rescue nation states. And this is why nation states are gatekeepers there. They created European Union to strengthen them rather than weaken them, basically to let them do things which states don't do properly. And the argument was, I think, correct. And as much as the rationale which you propose is appealing, I believe that democracy has to come not from the top, but from the bottom. And I, so far, seen people really campaigning on European topics when they protest the no global movement and they destroyed Göteborg because there was EU summit. This is where spontaneous people gathered, not paid by European Commission, you know, to some of the meetings selected of so. And so what I think democratic change, if it has to be genuine, has to come from the bottom, not from the top. So while I agree with this logic, the whole point is to convince citizens of our countries is that actually Europe works for them. But not as, but I add to this, not just Europe, because I constantly emphasize that local actors are equally important as transnational actors. And also private actors who contribute to public goods, and not just bureaucratic entities, you know. But this cannot come, this change cannot be orchestrated by decree. It has to come, if it is going to work and stick to people, from the bottom. Because, you see, the problem with legitimacy is like this, that we in Europe relied too much on output legitimacy for obvious reasons we discussed, because EU has opportunity to provide goods which nation states cannot, and too little on input legitimacy in the EU. And the output legitimacy is good when the weather is good. But as you know, as we've seen today, the weather is not always good. And then you need people to stick to the project even if it doesn't deliver for a time, you see? And this has to be done in a different way. You know, in the nation, it's done because very often mythology of the nation and kind of primordial links. But in organizations like the EU, it's more difficult, you know, difficult to create this kind of, you know, cultural, spiritual unity. You have to do it because people believe that they are owners of the project. You need to make them feel owners of the project, one way or another. And without this, I think we cannot, see, efficiency is not enough, although I constantly try to show that the democracy needs to perform too. It's not enough to have a symbolic attachment. Exactly as you said, because people have symbolic attachment to the nation, but nation state doesn't do what it's supposed to do, because it's unable in this new world. This is my answer to the question. So we have to make people think differently. Start with here, and then politics takes its place.
I mean, I'll let Caroline respond, and I know we also have to wrap up. I mean, I'm quite pessimistic, considering the Commission is not willing to intervene in violations of democracy in member states right now. Where there is a request by citizens to intervene, and we can think of the Polish case, the Hungarian case, various other cases. Caroline.
Not entirely true. It's changing a little, and it's good that it's changing a little. The Commission just took Poland again to court, or was it Hungary again, or both? I mean...
Long overdue.
Long overdue. Yeah, but there was also a reason why the Commission didn't do it, because the member states didn't want her to do it. And they have to approve it. And so again, we see this very heavy the member states are sometimes preventing the Commission to do what she must do.
Starting with Germany and France. They don't want to be told by the European Commission.
Nobody wants to be told by the European Commission. Nobody wants that. They're all afraid, we'll be next. On the European level, fostering a European democracy, I think you can also turn it around. What I think of immediately is that Europe is so intergovernmental, has become so intergovernmental at the moment, that every time that there's an election somewhere, everybody's like, uh-oh, what? Because whoever wins the election in Thüringen, in the old East Germany soon, it has a reflection on the mood in Germany, and that has repercussions on what is happening in Europe. With Meloni, we discussed this over dinner briefly. A lot of people were like, "Oh, this could be it could make things worse on the European level. And what if Le Pen becomes the next president of France? If Macron continues with his center grouping, continues to be so unpopular. So we're actually prisoners almost, also on the European level, of national democracies. That's what comes to my mind first.
So the trap remains. I realize we've run out of time, but we can continue this conversation over drink. So I wanted to thank you both for the diagnosis, for some still very complicated proposals for solutions that we've seen are even more complicated that we've outlined. Thanks to all of you for being here with us and helping us think through this further. But as I said, I encourage all of you to stay here for drinks, and we can continue the conversation in a different format. And to those of you who had questions, thank you for your patience. I'm sorry we didn't get to them. So you get first dibs at the speakers by the bar. Thanks so much, but thank you to our speakers especially.